Good afternoon, everyone. As was just said, my name is Darlene, and I'm an attorney at the Public Interest Law Center. And I focus specifically on making sure that students with disabilities ages 14 to 21 are getting the appropriate transition services that they need from their schools. And so what we're going to talk about today is how to use the Individualized Education Program, or IEP, as the foundation for your student success for now and also in the future. So before I get started, I just want to give this quick legal disclaimer. What I'm about to tell you is not legal advice. Cases are very fact-specific, and if you have individualized questions, you should certainly consult with an attorney. I do have business cards, and my contact information is at the end, and I'm happy to talk with any of you, whether it be after this presentation or at a later date. So just a little bit about the Law Center. We were founded in 1969 as part of the Civil Rights Movement. We are one of the branches of the Lawyers for Civil Rights Under Law that the President Kennedy started in order to help individuals in the South get their rights to vote and other things. And so we've continued to work to make sure that citizens are getting their social and economic needs met. So we have 6 practice areas. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I just wanted you to see those. And one of the areas that we work on is education, and that includes special education. But one of the other things we're doing in education, if you're familiar, is the education funding lawsuit against the state of Pennsylvania for how they're allocating money through the funding formula. So we are part of that case. So our objectives for today are 3 of those, and it's describe what characteristics make an effective post-school goal, give examples of transition services related to further education, employment, and independent living, and to identify the role of the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation in the transition planning process. If you have questions, please hold them till the end, just so someone can come around with a microphone. This is being recorded, and we just want to make sure that everyone can hear. But please feel free to write them down and save them, and I certainly will allocate time for questions. So the best place to start is with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is the federal law that allows students with disabilities to get an education that meets their unique needs. And one important thing for everyone in the room to know is that students can be covered by the IDEA until age 21. And the main tool used to fulfill the purpose of the IDEA and to give students a unique education that fits their needs is the Individualized Education Program, better known as the IEP. So what exactly is an IEP? An IEP is a written statement for which each child with a disability that includes the present levels of academic and functional performance. It includes measurable annual goals, and it includes the specific services to be offered. The IEP must be reviewed at least once per year, but parents can ask for meetings more frequently than that if there is an issue. Also, just as a reminder, the IEP is a binding legal document. So who are the members of the IEP team, particularly as we talk about this transition planning process? The most important member of the IEP team is the student, because it's their future that we're planning for, and so we want to make sure that they take a really active role in the planning process. And the The other important team member, obviously, is the student's family member, because they know their student better than anyone else. There's also a requirement for one regular education teacher if your student is in any regular education classes, one special education teacher, and one administrator from the district or person from the district who not only has the authority to say yes or no to services, but also has knowledge about what services are available. But the IEP team can also include anyone else the family would like to include. So that could be a sports coach, a counselor, it could be representatives from other agencies. But just remember, it can just be a family friend because the IEP can be an overwhelming and emotional process. And so sometimes it's really nice to have somebody there that's not as emotionally connected to the outcome. So transition planning as part of the IEP. While the federal law, the IDEA, requires transition planning to start at 16, Pennsylvania law requires that it start at 14. And once a student turns 14, the IEP must also include measurable post-school goals in addition to the annual goals that you typically find, and those goals must be in further education and training, employment, and independent living. And I really like this graphic because I think it really helps sort of give a framework of how this is, what is this supposed to look like. So where your student is currently is like the short-term goals, like what are we trying to get them to do in the next few months maybe. And then the annual IEP goals, which is what would we like for them to achieve in a year. And the post-school goals finally are what are they going to do once they leave high school. So in order to create an effective transition plan, there are 3 components. The first is transition assessments. Second are post-school goals. And finally, transition services. And we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these 3 components moving forward in the presentation. So transition assessments, what are they? They're an ongoing process of collecting data about your students' strengths, interests, preferences, and also where they are currently functioning. There are different types of assessments, including formal and informal assessments. And here's just some examples. The aptitude test would be formal assessments, and informal would be interviews or direct observation. But before we move on to post-school goals, I just want to say about assessments, I feel like this is an area that just like students take assessments in math and reading to tell you where they are on those kinds of skills, there should be transition assessments because this assessment data is what's going to drive or should drive how you create post-school goals and what kinds of services should be included in your student's IEP. So just a few suggestions around that. Before you attend an IEP meeting, I would ask if there were any assessments done around transition planning. And if there were, you'd like to get a copy of those before the meeting so you have some time to review them. If assessments have not been done, there is a link that I've included on the app that has resources. And some of the resources are particularly around assessments. And so they are free. They're something that you can have your students do outside of school. So as I said, The law requires that there be post-school goals in further education and training, employment, and then the law says where appropriate, independent living. I would like to encourage all of you that even if you don't think your student's going to live independently by themselves, right after high school, I encourage you not to leave that section of the IEP blank, because there's always things that students can work on to help increase their independence. You can be very creative with these kind of goals, so it could be about how they're going to travel around their communities. It could be about doing some sort of functional math skills, like learning about percentages and how much an item would cost if it was on sale. And so I just really encourage you to make sure that that section has a goal in it as well. So I think one of the tricky parts, particularly for families, is how do you know what's a good goal, what's a bad goal, or an effective goal? And so I have some examples here. And so you'll see with the good example, it says, after graduation, Paolo will work 20 plus hours a week in the local grocery store with temporary supports from the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. And then the bad goal says Paolo will be referred to the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation for assistance with job placement. And I want to take a little time to go through why the first one is a much better goal. One, it tells you the time period, so you know that it's happening after graduation. Two, it's measurable because it tells you the number of hours that Paolo will work. It gives you a little bit of detail about the kind of environment that he's going to work in. And it also has that interagency collaboration between the school district and the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, providing him supports. Where the bad post-school goal, just simply referring a student to another agency is not having the school district actually really do their part in providing transition services. And so that is not sufficient for it to be an effective post-school goal. Okay, but I don't want to do all the talking because, I get a little tired. So can somebody read out these two goals for me? Yes, please. Oh, actually, 1 second. I guess you would need the microphone, but I'm not. Oh, yeah, could you bring it up here? Sorry about that. Thanks. The woman right here in the white jacket. Yeah, thank you.
Your turn. After graduation, Gemaria wants a new, less visible hearing aid. After graduation, Alex will enroll at King's College and take a business math class to improve his work-related math skills and to advance his career in business.
Great, thank you so much for reading that. Would somebody else like to tell us which goal you think is better for this student and maybe why you think that is?
The second one, because it has more detail and is a much better descriptive answer.
And it's also tied to his interest, right, of doing business, so they're taking a business math course. So, yep. So, as you may recall from the pyramid I showed you, there's the post-school goal at the top, and then in the middle is the annual IEP goal. And so when you write annual IEP goals for your student, you want to make sure that you're keeping that post-school goal in mind. And so an effective annual goal for Paolo, who we just talked about, who wanted to work at the grocery store, would be something like, given a task, instruction, and analysis for bagging groceries, Paolo will demonstrate the steps with 80% accuracy by a specific date. Because again, it's tied to what he wants to do in his career choice, and allows us to get data about which steps he's doing well and maybe not so well. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about the goal setting process, the other big piece of transition planning is transition services. And the law defines transition services as a coordinated set of activities designed to help a student move from school activities to post-school activities, including further education, employment, and independent living. The school district can partner with other agencies to provide these kinds of transition services as well. So now we're going to go through some examples of what can be included as a transition service related to each of those three areas that we have mentioned. So for post-secondary education, it could be purchasing assistive technology and training the student on how to use it. And I think this is really important because once a student gets to college, it can be overwhelming to try to learn new technology while also adjusting to the college environment, where if the student is already familiar with the technology, so whether it be text-to-speech or something to help them, whatever that technology would be, if they're already familiar with it because they've practiced it and used it in high school, it just makes the adjustment much easier. It's also about enrolling in courses that align with the student's post-school interest. And again, the purpose of the transition assessments is to help students identify what they might be interested in based on both their interest and preferences, but also their functional skills. And so once you have that kind of information, then it's about enrolling in courses that allow the students to pursue those skills, whether that be through electives or other opportunities. It can also be visiting college campuses or trade schools. But I think it's really important for families to know that often what I see from a practical perspective on the transition services, help Johnny attend a college fair. And that's a great service, right? We want our students to be exposed to the different college fairs out there, but that service in and of itself is not going to be enough to get your student from where they are to where they want to go. And so when you talk with your school about services, really think about what it is that you're trying to have your student accomplish in this year, and really think about the kinds of services that they really need to be able to do that. So for transition services related to independent living, and these are just examples, definitely non-exhaustive, but it could be classes on cooking or budgeting. It could be self-advocacy, particularly around a student's differences and what accommodations allow them to be successful. It can also be getting a driver's license or learning to use public transit or some sort of car service like Uber or Lyft. And one thing that I did want to flag for all of you, even though we're not going to talk about it in this presentation because they could be their own presentations within themselves, but it's also part of transition planning should be talking about what other agencies the student can get services through, whether that be once they turn 18 or 21. So those services could be Social Security Disability. They could be the Office of Intellectual Disability Services in Pennsylvania or the Bureau of Autism Services. Each one of those entities has their own eligibility requirements and also what it takes to actually apply for each of those. And so what I would say is if you think your student would qualify for any of those agencies, find out as soon as you can, because one of the big things, particularly with the intellectual disability services or the autism services, is that there's often a pretty long waiting list. And so the earlier that you can apply, the better. And I just wanted to also say one other thing about self-advocacy skills, particularly around the students' disability and the accommodations. I like to remind all the families that I work with and speak to that whether a student goes to college or goes directly into employment, the Office of Disability Services, which is typically what the college has, they have some sort of disability services office. They're not going to want to speak to you as a parent, and in fact, they may not speak to you at all. They're going to want to speak directly to your son or daughter. And also, in order for an employer to provide your student with an accommodation, your student's going to have to come to the employer, self-identify as a person with a disability, and then explain what kinds of accommodations that they were going to need. And also in college, the student has to self-identify as a student with a disability. And so that skill of being able to talk about your disability and explain what kinds of services you need is going to be crucial regardless of what they do next in life. And so it can definitely be a challenging conversation for your students, but the IEP is a great place to practice. The IEP meeting and the team meeting is a great place for them to practice what they might say. And before I go into the examples of transition services related to employment, I just wanted to go back to one thing that I forgot to mention earlier in the presentation. Under the law, transition planning has to start at 14, which I said, but students actually have to be invited to the IEP meeting anytime you're talking about transition planning, and so that typically starts at 14. But even if your student doesn't attend the meeting, which I do encourage the IEP team to work towards that, where your student is attending and participating in the IEP meeting. If that's not possible for your student, the IEP team still has to take steps to make sure that the student's interest and desires were part of the conversation. So that I just wanted to highlight that for families. With regard to the transition services related to employment, again, here's just a few examples. It could be job shadowing, it could be work-based learning experiences, it could be attendance at job and career fairs, and it can also be vocational assessments. But one of the challenges that I have seen throughout my time doing this work is that teachers, while they and other educators, while they are very well trained in sort of the academic realm, employment isn't where they've received training in how to find employment and how to match students with particular challenges to employment is not where they've receive training. And so one agency that they typically partner with is the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, which is the state agency responsible for helping people with disabilities, not just students, prepare for, obtain, and maintain employment. And so I've given you their phone number here and just some other resources. And there are, I believe, 21 district vocational rehab offices, and so you can find one near you. The other law that I wanted to make sure that families and all of you as people in this space of transition are aware of is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And it was enacted in 2014 specifically to bolster the nation's workforce development. And it seeks to improve employment outcomes for individuals with disabilities. And it requires that 15% of the Office of Vocational Rehab's federal funding be spent on what are called pre-employment transition services. And the law lays out these pre-employment transition services, and there are 5 required activities. That's job exploration counseling, work-based learning experiences, counseling on post-secondary education opportunities, workplace readiness training, and self-advocacy training. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, better known as WIOA, also emphasizes interagency collaboration, so getting VR counselors to work with school districts and IEP teams. Specifically, if an OVR representative is invited to an IEP meeting, they are required to attend where possible. And so, again, remember that it doesn't have to be schools that invite them, but parents also have the ability to invite OVR counselors. WIOA also requires coordination with the Department of Public Health, the Department of Public Welfare, the Department of Health, and really any other state agency. But then Pennsylvania decided to pass an additional law called the Work Experience for High School Students with Disabilities Act, and this was passed in 2016, and it also requires OVR counselors to attend IEP meetings when invited, but in addition, it requires OVR offices, district offices, to keep data about the number of students that they are serving with regards to pre-employment transition services, and then publish that data on their website. And so I think it's really just valuable information to really understand, what's going on in your particular county. And so I have a link to where the reports can be found as well. And as part of my role at the Law Center, I also do an analysis of the reports as they come out. Sometimes when I encourage providers from other agencies to get involved in the IEP process, or to, get a copy of the IEP. Sometimes I hear, well, that's not really our area. We have our own sort of service plan, like the individualized plan for employment through OBR, or the individualized service plan through the intellectual disability services system. And what I like to remind all of them is that, we're all working towards the same goal. We're all trying to make sure that our students are getting prepared for their lives after school. And so it's really important that all of them come to the table. And so everyone can understand what services are being provided by whom, and what kinds of progress is being made. And so I often encourage representatives from other agencies to attend those kind of meetings so that they really can understand what's happening. How many of you have seen this grid before? I'm just curious. Okay, this is the grid that's found in the IEP section on transition planning. This is the grid that you will see where they put in the transition services. And so for each service or activity, then there should be a location where will the child complete the service? How often will the child complete the service? And don't allow the school to just write as needed, because it doesn't really tell you anything. It doesn't allow you to really assess progress. As far as the projected start and end date, and then you also have the person and agency responsible. And this is where, if you were getting some sort of job shadowing through the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation or another entity, that could be listed in the IEP, and then they would just be listed as the person or agency responsible. And if for whatever reason that service is not being provided, then the law requires that the IEP team meet and come up with another way for that student to be receiving that service. Because once it's in the IEP, it's deemed that that student needs that service. And so now the question is, well, how are we going to get the student that service? So I wanted to provide these potential examples to you so that you can see the differences in what the services could look like. And so you'll see with this first example, the services are all Monday through Friday, and it's just really based on the school schedule. And I know you probably can't read it, particularly in the back, but it says at the bottom that for the employment goal, the student does not have interest in going to college and they want to work at McDonald's. But as far as the services and activities listed there, it talks about increasing math skills, increasing reading skills, and it's really academic focused. And I recognize that that may be part of the process for a student to be able to work, right? They need high enough math skills, they need high enough reading skills, but they also need to understand how to create a resume, and they need to understand there's just so many additional things, and so that's what really the transition section is for. with this second set of transition services, it talks about the student doing some job shadowing. It talks about the student creating a resume and filling out job applications. And those are the kinds of things that you would want to see as part of the transition plan, particularly as your student gets older and gets closer to that graduation, because the plan should get more specific as the student gets closer to the graduation point. And of course, it's fine for the plans to change. If your student's desires change, that's exactly what should happen, right? But we definitely wanted to see it get more specific. And I didn't include the slide in this presentation, but I just want to say to you that an effective annual goal for this particular student could be something like, given an unfamiliar job application, the student would complete the application in 4 out of 5 trials with 4 prompts by a specific date. But if one of the things that your student's going to want to do is work at McDonald's, they have to understand how to fill out that job application. So before we get to questions, I just wanted to give you guys my contact information, and I can take questions now. Sometimes this presentation goes longer because I take questions in the middle, and then so then we might talk about something that wasn't necessarily in the presentation. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. I had a question regarding your examples of post-school goals. I'm a consultant who trains teachers on writing the transition grids. And my concern and question is, for example, after graduation, Paolo will work 20 plus hours a week at the local grocery store. So my question to you from a legal standpoint is, what happens, because we're in that goal, it's kind of guaranteeing that he's going to do that. What happens in a situation maybe Paolo gets into some behavior issues and can't work anymore? So what is our legal obligation? Because if we're guaranteeing that a student's going to do that, where's that line drawn?
Yeah, that's a great question, so thank you. From a legal perspective, I will say courts and the case law have not found any sort of guarantee within this sort of transition plan, right? What it really requires is for you to expose students to opportunities. So maybe a better way to write it is that Paolo intends to work at a, but even if you wrote it this way, I don't think anyone from a legal perspective would actually, put your, say, because you wrote it this way, you're responsible to make sure that actually happens. But I think the question would be, okay, well, what did you do to get him towards that goal? If there were some behavior issues that you obviously couldn't foresee or control when you wrote this, I don't think that would be a problem from a legal perspective.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
My question's about the grid. Again, I'm a school district transition coordinator. So on the grid, transition grid, there is a difference between activities and services. Services are measurable. Activities are done at any time, any place, by anyone. So I just wanted to make sure that there is some clarification there on the person responsible. On the right-hand column, it said teacher, and really it's everybody on the team. So those services and the activities can be done by family members. So when you say college tour or, anything along those lines, getting a state ID, that's something that the family can do. It's the team is making the recommendation of what can we all do together during the next year coming up at the annual meeting, to get the student where he or she should be. So I just wanted to clarify that it's not all on the school district, because we clearly don't have the resources to be able to take every student to every college that he wants to go visit, or take every student to, apply to get their state ID or driver's license. Does that make sense?
No, it makes perfect
Okay.
sense, yeah. And thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. Hello, transition coordinator. I am also a transition coordinator, and I will tell you, your statement shocks me. We have been told by our intermediate unit that we cannot commit a parent to anything on the transition grid. So here's how I get around it. I say, you asked about ID. The Sunrise School will provide a list of and information. Then, as far as the college visits, a virtual tour. So I find that interesting that there are so many interpretations across the Commonwealth as to what we are to do and what we are not to do. And I came out of a school district to be a TC, and in that school district, we were told parents are not permitted to be assigned anything in the transition grid. So, based on that, what is your interpretation?
I will also say just that we do write a recommendation
Hold on,
to get a driver's license or something like that, because it may not happen in the year. So, student will be provided with.
Okay, I'll just kind of summarize that exchange that happened there. It was just that the school district often provides recommendations that the student get an ID or driver's license because it may not happen within that particular school year. There was also another suggestion that student will be provided with a list of resources on how to obtain those, I assume the ID or the driver's license or any sort of, service like that the school doesn't traditionally provide. And then I'm sorry, the follow-up question to that was what is my interpretation? So doing this from a parent perspective, I was also under the impression that parents could not actually be listed as the person responsible for a transition service or activity. But I also do recognize that there are certain things that, parents are more in a position to be able to better be able to do than the school district. And so I don't want to say confidently either way. I think that's something that you should talk about as a team and really explore.
If you have a question, you need the mic.
Right. So in that right-hand column, we always write the name of the school district, but we're making the recommendation. So that's how we interpret that, is that who's responsible. We are responsible for making that recommendation that you go on a college tour, not to take your student on a college tour. Unless we're going and it's a field trip, and then that's awesome. But I'm saying that may not happen. And the tour might be canceled due to weather. The child might be sick on the day that the tour is scheduled. It's that kind of stuff. Like, I always take my students on a tour of our community college every year. Some people go, some people don't. Some people go on their own. So it's very obviously individualized, but we interpret it by making the recommendation to do some of the activities. Some are done in school, but some have to be done outside of school.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I guess I had a couple questions. Number one, for you guys that are transition coordinators, does every high school have that position? Is that like a requirement? Because I will say my child has finished 9th grade and is about to turn 15, and we requested transition services this past year on her IEP, and we were refused it. I called OVR and I was told, no, there's nothing available for her.
OVR is different than their
Well, but so both.
invite them, but they don't necessarily, they may not be able to come due to scheduling conflicts.
Okay.
But no, if my understanding is every district has somebody assigned in that role. It could be a teacher, it could be an administrator, somebody who should have that title. And
Okay.
different jobs in conjunction with transition.
Okay.
Every district, like I work for a larger school district, so I am the transition coordinator. The smaller district might have somebody who does that and also has a case.
Okay. So basically, they just ignored our request and poo-pooed it.
I answer that, but.
So,
And let me also just say that Pennsylvania State Code, so the regulations, do require each district to have persons responsible for overseeing transition planning. They don't have to be called a transition coordinator, and like the audience member said there, they may have other. There's nothing in the law that lays out what that person does or what they're required to do, but it does say that every district should have somebody designated to do that.
okay. But part of my concern too was one of your slides you were talking about that once a child turns 14, that transition planning should be part of the IEP. And we were disregarded with our request for that. So really, we were correct in asking for it. The school district didn't do what it should have, is what it sounds like.
Well, I will say that you are correct in asking for it.
Okay.
I don't want to talk, specifics, but yes, you are certainly correct and entitled and should be asking for transition planning once your student turns 14.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just add one thing. I'm actually a compliance monitor, so I go out to school districts and state penitentiaries, county prisons, detention centers. So the fact that you had to ask for it, that's a problem. So you can always file a complaint with PDE.
Let us be careful about the interpretation of age 14. The federal statute says 16. Chapter 22 of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania says 14. However, you cannot coordinate the writing of that IEP with the student's birthday. So what I say is the catchment age of 14. So if I have a student who's going to turn 14 within the catchment time of that IEP, it's not unusual for me to survey and interview that student and have transition activities and services on the grid. And then as far as your question about the requirement for a TC, everyone here has given you input, and all of those facts are accurate. So here's what I would suggest, other than talking to him. I would suggest that you go on PDE. There are now 500 school districts. Every school district is listed, and the name of the TC indigenous to each school district is on there. And as a matter of fact, you may see more than one name. So at the Allegheny Intermediate Unit, you'll see 3 names because there are 3 of us that work at the various schools. But every public school entity, I'll even go that far, not just the school districts, are required to have a TC because our kids are guaranteed transition services federally and state through Chapter 22.
What rights do families have if the IEP is not followed? I've heard of several instances where families feel that their child's not given the education that they feel that they should have. They've been looking into, this is a public school, they've looked into an autism school, and the school district denied, they're telling them that they do not have the right to go to this autistic school. So what rights do the families have? What could they do in in regards to the school district telling them these things?
So as far as your rights as parents, well, one of the things that you can certainly do is file a complaint with PDE about that. You can also file what's called a due process complaint, and there's the Office of Dispute Resolution for Pennsylvania, and they have documents. They have sample complaint forms and things that you can fill out to file a complaint. They also have guides about how you actually do that. But I would say, before so you certainly have rights to file complaints and file a complaint, whether it was PDE or through a due process hearing. But I would certainly, there are also other ways to resolve disputes through the Office of Dispute Resolution, like mediation. And I'm forgetting one right now, but right, it's the Office of Dispute Resolution, yes. And so mediation is where a third party sort of comes in and acts as a neutral, not decision maker, but acts as someone that is familiar with the law and, can sort of guide both parties as to what might be the best solution. There's also facilitated IEP meetings where you can get an outside person to come to an IEP meeting. But all of those are described in more detail on the Office of Dispute Resolutions website, and so I would recommend going there. They also have parent tutorial videos.
There's also a 1-800 number that you can call too. So if you go to PD's website, you'll see it. Just type in, and there's a 1-800 number where you can actually talk to somebody from the state about your concerns, and they'll direct you. Can you pass this?
Don't say anything.
I will not spit today.
Should have brought some sneakers.
Hi, I'm a parent of a special needs child. I'm also a special education teacher. I have a question as far as self-advocacy. You stated that students need to self-identify as a person with a disability for their employment and or school.
So, so for post-secondary school.
Right.
Right. And for employment, it's only if you actually want accommodations from the employer. You obviously never have to disclose that you have a disability if you don't need that to be able to do the job. But
Okay, because I have I had a student 2 years ago where the school district told them that, you need to self-identify because this particular student needed accommodations. However, the parents did not want this student to self-identify with the employer. How would you go about addressing that with the parents, because they didn't want their child to be treated differently, however, they did need accommodations?
yeah, so that's a very difficult conversation to have sometimes. But I like to remind, once a student turns 18, they are able to self-identify, and so like if you were doing it for an employer, it's not about necessarily what the parent wants, right? I mean, as difficult as that may sound, it's not what the parent wants, and so it's really about having a conversation with the student and seeing how they feel, while also explaining that if you are having a difficulty in the job because you're not getting accommodations that you need, you can still be, if the employer doesn't know that you have a disability and need these accommodations, you can be disciplined just like any other employee, including, termination if that's what it comes to. And so I would just say that if the student really needs those accommodations to be successful, that's just something that's gonna have to happen. But that also just might mean that that's not the job for them. Like, there's obviously other options, but if you want accommodations, you do have to disclose. Oh, I think we have a question over here. I actually have a question for you. Not to put you on the spot as a compliance monitor, but if you would be willing to indulge my question, for families who may not know, school districts get monitored on indicators of performance under the IDEA, and one of the indicators is on transition and post-school planning and transition planning. And while the goal for that indicator is 100%, the state of Pennsylvania as a whole is at about 83% compliance, and that really varies by district. And so I would just ask, from a compliance perspective, are there certain things that you see over and over again, that whether it be about not having measurable goals, or are there certain patterns that you see that parents, could think about, or not doing assessments, so I was just curious.
Assessments. So sometimes they don't update the assessments. Sometimes the kids' plans might change. So most of the times when we go in and we'll pull files, you'll see that they haven't conducted an assessment in quite some time. So it's the post-secondary levels, so basically making sure that assessment data was updated, explaining exactly what does the results mean, rather than just listing data. And then just the language, like, you can't guarantee that a kid's going to college. I used to work at a college a long time ago as a counselor, and so you can't guarantee that they're going to get into the college. So we tend to do as best practice, use the opportunity to, plans to, rather than being exact, just in case the kid doesn't get accepted, or maybe gets in trouble with the law and his charges prevent him from applying to get financial aid, et cetera. So let's see, so the measurable annual goals, making sure that all conditions are met, so that when we go through the file that we can check off each part of it. I'll probably say that's it pretty much. And also, if the student doesn't have a independent living goal, just make sure that you have some type of data just to back it up, rather than just saying that the kid doesn't need a goal, and then leave the rest of it blank after you just put no. So it's just stuff like that, just little minor things. But it's the same across the state, west, central, and east.
To assess a student means that the student is going to share, let me reframe that, that if the student is going to respond to prompts. So now you have what I call assess data. The next step, it's not just the assessment, it's the survey also. So what we do is we ask kids, what do you want to do? The kid is the source of the information. Now we have expressed data. So what I do is I take that assessed data, I compare it to the expressed data. What's the correlation between the two of those, and where are we really headed with these kids? And I would also share that, if I am correct, that there are 3 benchmarks that are related to transition. Because we used to have 20, now we have 17, and I think there are 3, if I'm correct. He's the boss, he would know.
I'm just a worker like you. And also, you can use informal assessments, though. It doesn't always have to be standardized.
And just in terms of one other resource that I didn't mention because we didn't really talk about today, but if your student has an intellectual disability or autism, there's a program called Fink College. I think it's .net or .org, but it's about college programs for students in those categories, and there are 200 plus programs across the country, and 96 of those programs allow for students who are dual enrolled, so they might still be enrolled in high school, but as part of their transition plan might go to one of these programs. And so that's just another sort of opportunity and resource that you might want to look into. But that, I believe, is also listed on the resource sheet that's included with the PowerPoint. So thank you all, and I will stick around if anybody has individual questions. Oh, you do need the code.
I don't know how many of you are familiar, but on Patton's website, they have secondary transition modules, modules 1 through 6. It breaks down the grid. So if you go to Patton's website, type in secondary transition, you should see a bunch of different little small webinars, modules 1 through 6, that breaks it down. And it covers some of the stuff that we just talked about today.